Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Nutrition 101 Online. Today, we're going to talk about lipids, but first, I'm going to review Quiz 1 because it's been due for a little bit now, and I'm about to post Quiz 2 after I record this lecture. So, we're just going to go right through it. Question 1. This is a question about calculating the number of calories in a food. 1/2 cup of Haagen-Dazs ice cream contains 5 grams of protein, 19 grams of carbohydrates, and 24 grams of lipid. How many kilocalories does it provide? So you figure this one out by multiplying the number of grams of the individual macronutrients by the number of calories that are possessed by each gram, and then adding those numbers together. So we have 5 grams of protein. So we know that there are 4 kilocalories per gram of protein. So we take 5 and multiply it by 4. And then we add the 19 grams of carbohydrates times 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. So 19 times 4. And then we add the calories from the 24 grams of lipids. Lipids have 9 kilocalories per gram, and there are 24 grams. So we add 24 times 9, and we get 312 kilocalories. So the answer to that question is B. Question 2. The major nutrients include. Major nutrients are nutrients that your body requires large quantities of. We talked about these in class as being protein, lipids, carbohydrates, and water. Notice here I accidentally gave you 2 choices that are the same. Either of those would have registered as correct. Question 3. Based on the nutrition facts label, which one is more nutrient dense? Now this one was a bit of a trick question because if you look at the actual quantities of nutrients and the amount of calories in each of these foods, they're about equal. So neither of them is more nutrient dense. They were both fairly nutrient dense. Question 4. What is the daily value for fat intake for a 2,500 calorie diet? So the way that you figure out fat intake for a 2,500 calorie diet is you either look at a food label that tells you how many grams of fat you should be taking in, or you could know that you need to take in 30% or less of your calories from fats. And so if you're on a 2,500 calorie diet, then you would multiply 2,500 by 0.3 for 30%, and that gives you a total of 750 calories from fat. And then you know that there are 9 calories per gram, so you divide by 9 and you get 83.33. And it says that you want to get less than that amount, and 80 grams is less than that amount, but close to it. Question 5. If you consumed 60 grams of protein in a day and 2,700 calories in that day, what percentage of your calories are derived from protein? So you have 60 grams of protein. You know that protein has 4 calories per gram, and so you multiply 60 times 4, you get 240, and then 240 divided by 2,700 is 0.088. If you multiply that by 100, it gives you 8.8%. Question 6. The factors that affect the nutrient needs of an individual are, we talked about this in class 2, generally we consider age, gender, activity level, and genetics to affect the nutrient needs of individuals. Food processing will tend to alter the nutrient content of food, but it doesn't change how much we need, nor does the freshness of food or cooking techniques. So it is A. Question 7. The amount of energy necessary to raise 1 kilogram of water, 1 degree Celsius is the definition of a kilocalorie. A calorie being the amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. 1,000 times that would be a kilogram in kilocalorie. 8. The nutrient that has no kilocalories is, on this list, water. Protein has 4 calories per gram, alcohol has 7 calories per gram, and carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. Question 9. Vitamin C is an essential nutrient. That means, choice A, it is made of unadulterated ingredients, so in its raw form, that is not really what it means to be essential. Essential means that it's needed by the body to survive and that your body can't make it itself. So the answer to this is answers B and C. Question 10. The daily values were assigned as a guideline for eating the proper amount of nutrients. Which list is correct? So we studied in class that you need at least 60% carbohydrates, 30% lipids, and 10% proteins in your diet, which is answer D. Question 11. The nutrient density of foods refers to foods that we said that nutrient density is the number of nutrients per calorie. So answer D, a nutrient-dense food will provide more nutrients for the least amount of kilocalories. Question 12. How does food move throughout the GI tract? This is a question about digestion, and we remember from our talk about the motion of food that it is the contraction of smooth muscles in the process of peristalsis that moves food through our bodies. Question 13, what are the compounds that digest your food? These are called enzymes. They're specialized proteins that are designed to assist specific chemical reactions in happening within your body. Question 14, nutrients are primarily absorbed where? That would be the small intestine. Nutrients are generally not very well absorbed in the esophagus. They are not absorbed in the liver, and the colon has some absorption, but not nearly as much as the small intestine. And question 15, which of the following is not a benefit of a healthy gut microbiome? So we talked about these benefits in class. So we said that a healthy gut microbiome will starve out harmful pathogens, produce antibiotic compounds that kill harmful bacteria, and will break down undigestible material into soluble fiber for absorption into the blood and lymph. So these are all benefits of a healthy gut microbiome. So this question I made a mistake on. This should just say which of the following are benefits of a healthy gut microbiome. So I apologize for people who got this wrong. I will fix this question in my grade book so that you don't get it wrong. Nobody gets this question wrong. All right, so that's quiz 1. Hopefully you all did it, and the next one will be posted soon. So now we're going to move on to our discussion of lipids. Lipids, also known as fats, are molecules that serve a variety of very important functions in your body. They provide energy, they help transport other fat and lipid molecules throughout your bloodstream. They carry fat-soluble vitamins. They give you signals of satiety, letting your body know when it needs to consume or is done consuming food. Helps transport nutrients to cells. A lot of lipids are the precursors for a number of hormones, including sex hormones. They are also the precursors to bile and cell membranes. There are 3 types of lipids found in the body and in food. The most common one that you've probably encountered before in great quantities are triglycerides. These are the fat that we eat and the fat that we store in our fat cells. There's another type of lipid called a phospholipid, which is a partially converted triglyceride molecule. This helps to make fat water soluble and is the main component of cell membranes. And sterols, which include cholesterol, are the precursors for hormones, and they're produced in the liver. In general, we don't have to consume sterols because we get them from synthesis in our livers from other molecules that we consume. So the first one we'll talk about are triglycerides. And triglycerides are named because they are a glycerol backbone attached to 3 fatty acids. And fatty acids are a type of molecule that are classified by a long carbon chain that is either what we refer to as saturated or unsaturated, which affects the shape of the molecule. And an saturated fatty acid can be either a natural saturated fatty acid or a trans fatty acid. These are surrounded by hydrogens, making them very long and straight, and this leads to them being solid at room temperature. Unsaturated fatty acids can be either mono or polyunsaturated and have carbon-carbon double bonds, which lends them structure and causes them to be liquid at room temperature. And here is a picture of the chemistry that's happening. Fatty acids are the most basic unit of fat. The length of the chain affects how much energy is in it. And you can see here that a saturated fatty acid has like a long straight chain which stacks well, allows it to form solids more easily. Things like lard and butter and margarine are all saturated fatty acids. Mono and polyunsaturated fats have double bonds which put kinks in the chain, making them not stack as well and retain their liquid structure. Things like peanut oil, olive oil are mono and polyunsaturated. And here we see a diagram of a triglyceride molecule. So this is the glycerol backbone, and it is attached to 3 fatty acids that are not necessarily all the same fatty acids, but they are all the same in this picture. And the characteristics of a fatty acid are the acid end, which has oxygens on it, and the non-acid end, which has a bunch of carbons. Notice there's the alpha end, which is the acid end, and the carbon tail, which is the omega end. And this will become important when we talk about omega fatty acids. This is a picture of oil and water. So when you mix oil and water, they don't combine into a solution because they have different polarities. We can get oil and water to mix by adding something called an emulsifying agent. In food science, that would be something like lecithin. Or mayonnaise is a good example of an emulsified food. There are also emulsifiers in your body that help you digest fats, which we'll talk about. But fats in general are useful in the diet because they provide essential fatty acids, which are important for rebuilding body tissues. They also provide a concentrated energy source because you tend to burn through sugar fairly quickly, and once the sugar is gone, you still need your muscles to be able to make energy, and so that comes largely from fat. I mentioned they carry fat-soluble vitamins. They also provide a lot of raw materials for various body products the body needs to make. Fats generally improve the taste and smell of foods and stimulate your appetite, as well as contributing to feelings of fullness. Fat also helps make food tender, which can be important in terms of help getting people to eat. And fats are the body's chief form of stored energy, and they provide most of the energy to fuel muscular work, as well as serving as an emergency fuel supply in times of illness and diminished food intake. They protect the body cavity and internal organs from shock, as well as insulating against temperature extremes, and they form the material of all of our cells, as well as being converted to other compounds. The takeaway message is that we absolutely need lipids and shouldn't remove them from our diet in their entirety, even if we have issues with triglycerides. The biggest issue is when lots of fat is added to food in order to substitute other more nutritive components. Another thing to remember is that lipids are not foods, but rather they're chemicals found in food, and they can come from both plant and animal sources. So butter, margarine, meat, olive oil, nuts, seeds, avocado, they're all sources of lipids. Examples of lipids are things like lecithin, which is an emulsifying phospholipid, and things like linoleic acid and linolenic acid, which are essential fatty acids. They have 9 calories per gram. And animal-based lipid sources often contain cholesterol, which is a non-essential lipid because your liver makes it. Fat enters your body in the intestines. Large fat droplets will get mixed with bile salts from the gallbladder in a process called emulsification. This mixture breaks up the large droplets into smaller droplets called micelles, increasing the fat surface area. The pancreas then secretes enzymes called lipases that attack the surface of each micelle and break the fats down into their parts, which are glycerol and fatty acids. You may see sometimes in an ingredient list, such as for non-dairy creamer, they'll say something like mono and diglycerides. That's when you start to digest a fat and you break off 1 or 2 of the fatty acids and leave behind the glycerol backbone with 1 or 2 of the other fatty acids. These parts get absorbed into the cell lining, and then within the intestinal cell lining, they are reassembled into what we call fat molecules or triglycerides again, and they are coated in a protein, which this whole structure is called a chylomicron, and this is what allows the fat to dissolve in your blood and lymph, which is water-based. Chylomicrons are the largest fat transport structure, and they are used for most of the large fatty acids that you consume in your food because the lymph system is better at transporting them to your muscles directly, where they can be used and also put into adipose tissue before they traverse to your liver to be used more effectively. Here's a diagram of that process. So most of the lipid digestion happens in the small intestine. However, some of it starts in your mouth and stomach. So in your mouth, your salivary glands produce saliva, which contains a small amount of lingual lipase, which digests some of the triglycerides, but not very many. Then you swallow, and the fat arrives mostly intact to your stomach, where it gets mixed and broken into droplets, and gastric lipase digests some more triglycerides and breaks off some of the short-chain fatty acids. Your liver produces bile, which gets stored in the gallbladder, and then once the food exits your stomach, the gallbladder contracts and releases bile into the small intestine, where the gallbladder will start to break the fat droplets into smaller droplets, and then lipid digesting enzymes from the pancreas are released as well, and they begin to break the triglycerides into monoglycerides and fatty acids. These lipid digesting enzymes also break dietary cholesterol esters and phospholipids into their components, which allows them to then be reassembled in the intestinal lining cells. The products of fat digestion combine with bile salts and form micelles, which you see here, and we'll see more up close in a little bit. This is a little spherical cavity with the water-soluble layer on the outside and the fat-soluble layer on the inside, and within this structure, fat molecules are held, so they can be transported into your body. Then those micelles enter into the enterocytes, which are the cells on the inside of your intestinal lining, and they're formed into the transport protein packages called chylomicrons, which go into the lymphatic system, and some of these shorter chain fatty acids go directly into the bloodstream to be used by tissues immediately. So I mentioned before, there's a class of fatty acids called essential fatty acids that your body can't make. And these are the ones that are most important for you to consume. The ones that I mentioned are linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. There are other omega-6 fatty acids, but they can mostly be produced from linoleic and alpha-linolenic acid, which is a omega-3 fatty acid. And these are the ones that can be made from that. These are the two most important ones that you'll often see labeled, although more and more these days I'm starting to see EPA and DHA listed as well, because omega-3s are more scarce in the diet than omega-6s and are of more focus when it comes to nutritional changes. Omega-6 fatty acids come from things like corn oil, sunflower oil, and soybean oil, and they contain these are fairly prevalent in the Western diet because we eat a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans, a lot of sunflower oil in our baked goods. Omega-3 fatty acids are a little more difficult. They come from things like flax and pumpkin seeds and walnuts, as well as salmon, trout, and tuna, which is why you see people taking fish oil supplements. Fish oil supplements have omega-3 fatty acids in them from fish. Generally, we think that these fats have to be about 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 or 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio. However, in most Western diets, we're getting something like 20-to-1 of omega-6 to omega-3s. And that isn't that great for you. This leads us to the grass-fed animal food labeling trend. In general, grass-fed animals, because they're eating green vegetables, and they can tend to contain more omega-3 fatty acids. They also, in general, contain 1/3 to 1/2 less fat, so they're lower in calories in general. It's about the same comparison as lean chicken or game, like venison. Specifically, grass-fed animals have about 5 times higher conjugated linoleic acid and more vitamin E. So eating the green leaves of plants allows cow stomachs have special enzymes in them that can break down the fibers in these leaves that make them into fatty acids. If you're eating grass-fed animals, you are 50% less likely to suffer from heart attack, brain dementias, and cancers. Another possibly more useful piece of information to anybody who is a vegetarian is that eggs from pasture-fed chickens have 20 times more omega-3 fatty acids. So you don't even have to kill an animal to get all these omega-3s. You can have a flaxseed and pumpkin seed omelet, and it will be perfect. Other things, whole milk is better for you because it has more omega-3s in it. So that's an interesting concept of whole milk actually reducing your cancer risk. Also, the higher amounts of vitamin E, which is an antioxidant which helps prevent cancer, could also explain that lowered cancer risk. And here is a very nice list of the omega-3 fatty acid content of various foods. And this list gives the total omega-3s as well as DHA and EPA, which are two of the acids that you didn't have to recognize the names of, but are considered somewhat maybe more essential than the first one. And you can see most of these are fish, but there's also a lot of oils. So flax seeds, I mentioned. Something people don't often consider is that canola oil has a decent amount of omega-3s in it, which is one of the reasons that it's used in a lot of cooking. Walnuts have a pretty high amount. Many of these things are seafood, but also avocados. Spinach also has some. That's useful. And this is a diagram that sort of just shows the percentage of fats in different foods that are saturated, monounsaturated, or polyunsaturated. And remember, the polyunsaturated ones are the ones that are going to have omega-3 and omega-6s. Butter doesn't have a ton. Whole milk has a little bit more polyunsaturated fat. Beef has very little. Eggs have a decent amount. A lot of the fish has a decent amount. Sesame oil has a large amount of polyunsaturated fat in it. It also has some proteins in it that you can't get anywhere else but from animal sources. So if you're a vegan, sesame oil becomes very important in your diet. And here's a picture of a group of polyunsaturated fat sources versus saturated fat sources. Notice the two plant sources of saturated fat list shown here: coconut oil and palm oil. It's unusual for plants to have so much saturated fat, but these can be very useful, and they were actually considered to be sort of like a miracle fat for a while because they have a shortening effect in culinary terms, meaning they can take the place of lard and butter. However, they are still saturated fat and are very high in calories, so you should still use them sparingly. We sort of stopped using these so much in the 50s because that's when it was discovered that saturated fat is connected with heart disease, and so everything was bad. All saturated fat was bad. It turns out it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a relationship between sugar consumption and fat consumption, as well as exercise. Generally, it's shown that a mixed fat diet, meaning one containing both saturated and unsaturated fats in the proper ratio, contributes to a healthy low-density lipoprotein to high-density lipoprotein ratio, which, if you have ever had your cholesterol tested, you may have seen these numbers. We'll talk about what exactly they mean as we talk about fat digestion a little bit more. And in general, coconut oil and palm oil are also useful because, different than the other saturated fat sources from animals, they contain no cholesterol. And sometimes on food labels, the types of fat will be delineated more specifically than total fat and saturated fat. It's not required to list polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats. However, because they are generally considered to be healthier, foods of quality will generally indicate how much of the fat is polyunsaturated or monounsaturated so that they can make health claims about their products. And here we're going to look at a collection of images that show different types of fat in various oils. There's a contrast agent added to the monounsaturated fat that makes it look red. So we're seeing on the bottom saturated fat, and then monounsaturated, and then polyunsaturated fat on top. You see here, safflower oil has a lot of polyunsaturated fat. Wheat germ has a lot of polyunsaturated fat. Corn and soybean have a lot of polyunsaturated fat. Whereas olive oil has a lot of monounsaturated fat, as does avocado. Rapeseed oil aka canola oil and peanut oil also have a lot of monounsaturated fat. And then coconut oil, palm kernel oil have a lot of saturated fat, cocoa butter and regular palm oil, as opposed to palm kernel oil, have a decent amount of saturated fat with also large amounts of monounsaturated fat. And then animal sources, we got butter and beef, lard. Even these have unsaturated fats in them in addition to their saturated fats, and some of meats have even more than others. So now that we've talked about fatty acids and triglycerides, we can talk about the next member of the lipid family, phospholipids, which are also made of a glycerol backbone, similar to triglycerides, but instead of having 3 fatty acids, they have 2, and then they have a choline molecule and some phosphate added to the 3rd position on the glycerol. And you don't have to really know that specific information, but it's useful to know. The triglyceride part, or the fatty acid part, is fat soluble, and the choline and phosphate is water soluble. This gives phospholipids the unique ability to emulsify fats in foods and in our bodies. And they can do this because they're both fat and water soluble. And here is a little cartoon image of the water soluble and fat soluble portions given in red and blue, respectively. And here is a nice schematic picture showing the phospholipid here. These are the fatty acids coming off of the glycerol backbone. And then there is phosphorus and choline here. This creates the structure that forms the basis of cell membranes. So you can see here the phospholipids line up tail to tail. It creates a water-soluble region here, a fat-soluble region in the middle, and another water-soluble region here, which effectively creates a barrier across which water has difficulty diffusing. And here is a nice image of an actual cell membrane. There's a lot more going on than just the phospholipid bilayer. There are also other proteins involved that help transport nutrients and water through the cell membrane because it can't get through these parts. There's also cholesterol in there and various sugars and proteins that have been bonded together to something called glycoproteins, and also sugars bonded to fats called the glycolipids. And the last type of molecule is sterols. Generally, sterols all have this basic ring structure that is large and flat and dense in both carbon and electrons. And it can be used to make things like cholesterol, and cholesterol can also come from things like cholesterol esters, which, if you notice here, looks like a fatty acid attached to this ring structure. Sterols are also, they can be gotten from plants, and they form the basis of things like vitamin D. So if you have a cholesterol molecule and you do some chemistry on it, you can break some of these bonds and create vitamin D. This chemistry turns out to be facilitated in the presence of UV light, which is why sunlight helps give you vitamin D3. Other things like bile acids, like cholic acid, can be made from the ring structure of sterols. Sex hormones like progesterone and testosterone and the precursors of estrogen can also come from sterols. And now that we've covered the 3 types of lipids, we can go back and really dig into the way that our body processes lipids. So, I mentioned before, the salivary glands produce lingual lipases that digest a little bit of lipids. The stomach produces some gastric lipases that just digest some lipids too. And the gallbladder provides bile, which helps emulsify fats in the small intestine and breaks them into droplets, which are digested by enzymes. these digested fats are then taken up by micelles and are transported into the enterocyte or small intestine lining cells. So the way that this happens is, say you have a fat globule in the watery GI juices of your small intestine. The enzymes are in the water and they can't get at the fat because the fat is separated from them. So the gallbladder comes in and shoots its bile into the bile duct. And then the bile comes in and attacks the surface of the fat and grabs a blob of it and encircles it. Since the bile is soluble in both water and in fat, it can form a little island of fat inside the water. Now that the fat is emulsified, these continue to break down into smaller and smaller droplets. And because of the concentrated fat surrounded by water, these fat globules repel one another. And as they get smaller, they become accessible to the enzyme, which can then come in and engulf them, which causes the bonds in the fats to get broken down. And this is the whole cartoon process here. Now, the bonds breaking in fat digestion are, this is what this is showing. So you have your triglyceride. The bonds on two of the fatty acids get broken, leaving behind one fatty acid attached to the glycerol. And these free fatty acids can get absorbed into the gut enterocyte. The monoglyceride can also be absorbed into the gut enterocyte or be incorporated into a micelle along with cholesterol and free fatty acids to be absorbed into the enterocyte in that way. So it can either just go directly in as a fatty acid or it can be transported in by a micelle. And once it's inside the gut cell, then the fatty acids within the micelle can be directly absorbed into the bloodstream if they're small, or they get combined with phospholipids, cholesterol, and monoglycerides inside of the endoplasmic reticulum to make what we call a chylomicron. And this chylomicron enters the lymph system and eventually goes to the bloodstream and then to the liver. And this is a structure of a micelle. So you have your phospholipid, you have your fat interior along with your cholesterol esters, and your triglycerides. And you have some proteins on the outside that aid in fat digestion. And now we're starting to talk about lipoproteins. So lipoproteins are made up of phospholipids as well as cholesterol and bunches of triglycerides and protein. They're little planets made of fat that hold onto the fat and keep it water soluble until it can be used by your body. The biggest of these is a chylomicron, which has this structure. And it has the highest percentage of triglycerides of any of the lipoprotein molecules. Once these chylomicrons have been moved around your body a little bit to your muscles, they get rid of some of the triglycerides because it gets used to make energy. And these, once they get small enough, can be sent back to your liver to be converted into very low density lipoprotein and low density lipoprotein, which has in general more protein, more cholesterol, and more phospholipids and less triglycerides. This makes them more useful for transporting quickly to various tissues in order to provide energy on a somewhat more long-term basis. And the more triglycerides get used, the more low density it becomes. Or sorry, the higher the density becomes, because the density increases as the amount of fat decreases. And eventually you get to something we call high density lipoprotein, which is when you have used up almost all of the triglycerides in the phospholipid structure. It gets sent, it picks up a bunch of cholesterol from your blood and brings it back to your liver to be reused. In general, you want a high count of HDL because that means that your body is effectively using its triglycerides and recycling its cholesterol. This is another diagram of the same proportions, but just a little bit more explanation. So chylomicrons are formed in the gut after a meal and released into the lymph, which point they go to tissues and then get into the blood. They are very large and have a very low density. Once some of the fat has been digested, then the liver takes them up. Then it makes very low density lipoprotein, some of which are formed in the liver and some of which are formed in the intestine. Obviously, if you are on a low-fat diet, you might make less chylomicrons and more very low-density lipoprotein, which is probably good because the more fat is in your chylomicrons, the more it will be stored as adipose tissue. Then low-density lipoprotein forms in the blood as the triglycerides in very low-density lipoprotein are digested. And this generally transports cholesterol to the cells of the body to be utilized in the fat digestion and also to be utilized for hormone production. And then high-density lipoprotein collects the cholesterol and brings it back to the liver in order to continue this process. And here's a nice little diagram showing the organs. So the small intestine, you make chylomicrons. This goes into your blood or lymph and goes to your adipose and muscle tissues and releases free fatty acids to be used in energy processes. Then the remnant of that goes to the liver to be made into VLDL and goes back into the bloodstream, goes to the adipose and muscle tissues and releases free fatty acids until it becomes LDL. And then it can continue to be used by muscle, or it can be sent back to the liver. And once it's used up by the muscle, it is basically just cholesterol, and it is then taken back up by HDL and transported to the liver for recycling. And this is a picture of blood flow to fat cells. So one of the ways that our body stores energy is in the form of adipose tissue. And these cells are a special type of cell that has a big globule of fat in the middle and then a cell membrane around it, which has the cytoplasm separated along with the nucleus from the fat part. So this brings us to a conversation about fat cells. They are more than storage. They're a metabolically active organ, basically, that has its own hormonal profile and can exist in different states. So there are three kinds of fat cells that represent the different states of adipose tissue. White fat cells are basically entirely stored triglycerides, which are there also for heat maintenance and cushioning besides energy. There are subcutaneous and visceral fat, but if it's white fat, it's not doing much besides just sitting there. Now, beige fat cells have some mitochondria in them, which mitochondria are the organelles in your cells that undergo cellular respiration. These cells will turn brown when you exercise intensely. Brown fat cells are highly metabolically active, which means they contain lots of mitochondria. This is the fat that insulates your organs, and it's very high in babies. Now, regardless of what color fat cells are, there's only room for about 1.2 micrograms of fat per cell. And these cells each produce hormones, most specifically leptin, adiponectin, and resistin. And you produce more of these if you have more fat. This is a diagram of a white fat cell. We have them, we need them. They're filled from caloric surplus, and if you overfill a fat cell, it'll divide by meiosis and become two fat cells. And you have a nucleus and then a large lipid droplet at the center. This is a more specific diagram. So when triglycerides are first entering, they go in at the periphery and form little droplets, which then merge with the central globule over time. The nucleus and cytoplasm are separated from the fat because they're water. And as the globule enlarges, the cell membrane expands to accommodate the swollen contents until it splits to form two. Now, there are a couple of enzymes that are involved in the storage and release of fat from fat cells. One of them is called lipoprotein lipase. As you can imagine, it is the type of lipase, which is a fat-dissolving enzyme that exists in lipoproteins. This hydrolyzes is a fancy word for cleaving the acid, or the acid end of the fatty acid, and releasing water. So basically a lipoprotein lipase digests the fat inside of lipoproteins and release fatty acids. After you eat, adipose cells fill themselves from chylomicrons and VLDL. There's another thing called hormone-sensitive lipase, which is inside of your adipose cell, and this dismantles stored triglycerides for release into the blood. It is stimulated by the exercise hormones, glucagon and adrenaline, as well as insulin. So here's a diagram of that process. So you fill a fat cell, glucose can go in, which gets converted into either a fatty acid or the glycerol backbone. Triglycerides go in to provide fatty acids. They all get combined together into triglyceride molecules. This occurs also through the action of lipoprotein lipase. And then if you need to use fat for energy, the fat cell will block glucose and amino acids, which are the components of proteins, from entering, and will allow hormone-sensitive lipase to break triglycerides down to produce fatty acids and glycerol. It's sensitive to things like epinephrine, which is adrenaline, growth hormone, ACTH, glucagon, which is the hormone that stimulates your muscles or to break down glycogen, and thyroid hormone, which is also important in metabolism. And then this shows the process of fat cells growing and dividing. So as you are growing and in your childhood, the fat cells increase in number. And then if your energy intake exceeds your expenditure, the fat cells will increase in size. And if they reach a maximum size, then they will split into more fat cells. And then if you lose fat, then these cells will decrease in size, but their number will not become smaller. And this is a handy little graph to sort of show you how your body uses this fat for energy. So we already talked about carbohydrates and glucose, and we talked about how that's the primary source of energy, especially for fast action early on in an exercise. A large chunk of what you're using is actually glycogen stored in your muscles, as well as a little bit of blood sugar. However, at least half of it is triglycerides coming from either your muscles or from adipose tissue. Now, obviously, as time goes on, the energy sources that are stored in your muscles will get used up. So your muscle triglycerides decrease, as well as your muscle glycogen. And on around hour 4, you're getting most of your energy from blood sugar and from adipose tissue. And the longer this goes on for, you can imagine this trend will continue, and you'll be using almost entirely adipose tissue to get your energy. So fat is essentially a discrete and active organ that exchanges information with the rest of your body by way of the bloodstream using hormones. It sends messages such as "I'm full" or "feed me," and in general, your desire to eat is correlated with how much body fat you have. Whenever you eat more calories than you expend, your fat cells will increase in size, and they can swell to as much as 6 times their original size. The average adult has 40 billion to 100 billion fat cells in their body. We saw before the diagram of the way the blood flow into fat cells happens via tiny capillaries. The more capillaries that are required will put strain on your cardiovascular system in the form of high blood pressure. And then one of the chemical messengers involved in body fat is called leptin. It's produced by fat cells, and it can cause things like high blood pressure and clotting and inflammation, which are obviously bad for you. It can also increase your resistance to insulin. This is generally through the action of another hormone called resistin. And then the counter effect is adiponectin, which generally decreases with the amount of body fat that you have. So it is the thing that makes you more sensitive to insulin, and resistin makes you less sensitive to insulin. Insulin being the hormone that causes your body to absorb, causes your cells to absorb glucose. And now that we've talked about the way that your body gets fat, we can talk about heart disease. So getting too much fat on a consistent basis will significantly increase the amount of triglycerides in your bloodstream at any given time. This will lead to eventually the accumulation of arterial plaque, which can lead to arterial clotting, which blocks blood flow to things like your heart and brain and can cause heart attacks, strokes, and heart failure. And in fact, heart disease was the leading cause of death and has been for many years in the United States. It's even higher than cancer. Both of these are almost certainly heart-related. Strokes are also, or diet-related, I'm sorry. Strokes are also almost certainly diet-related. The only other non-alcohol-related cause of death that's reasonably high is diabetes. But it just goes to show you that moderation of food consumption and also alcohol consumption can significantly decrease your chance of dying unexpectedly. Although if you get pneumonia or influenza, or I guess COVID, then maybe you're out of luck anyway. Turns out that men have a much higher risk factor than women in terms of dietary factors. Men with no risk factors had a 31 in 1,000 rate of heart disease. If you have high cholesterol, that number goes up. If you have high cholesterol and high blood pressure, that number goes up even more. And then if you have high cholesterol, blood pressure, and smoke cigarettes, you have a very high rate of risk factor for heart disease. There are a number of dietary factors that can protect you against these things. So soluble fiber, we mentioned in the carbohydrates section, coming from things like apples and fruits, as well as oats, barley, and legumes, will help lower your blood cholesterol, especially if you have high cholesterol. And it does this by improving your LDL to HDL ratio. This will in turn lower your risk of heart attack. Increasing the amount of omega-3 fatty acids in your diet will help limit clot formation and prevent irregular heartbeats, and also lower your risk of heart attack. Interestingly enough, small amounts of alcohol, it can actually raise your HDL content and prevent clot formation, as well as reducing homocysteine, which is an inflammatory response molecule. And then things like folate, which is also known as vitamin B6, as well as vitamin E from vegetable oils and margarines, can help slow the progression of plaque formation and lower the risk of heart attack in people with CHD. This shows the formation of plaque, and they're showing it in a coronary artery, which is an artery that delivers blood to your heart. And you can see here the plaque tends to form at branching pathways in the arteries, and they can appear in a person as young as 15 years old. Healthy arteries, of course, provide open passages for blood flow, as shown here. And if blood flow is cut off to a section of the heart, the muscles in that section of the heart will begin to die. And you can imagine that having dead tissue on your heart is not good for it. This is a diagram of this process happening. So we have a healthy arterial cross-section here. Plaque accumulates because of high levels of lipids in the blood. And then these high levels of lipids generally lead to an increased inflammatory response. So any small injury on the interior of the artery will lead to the accumulation of white blood cells and fat molecules on the inflamed part. These will then get attacked by white blood cells and start to get digested, and this will form a fatty streak on the artery, which will then continue to release inflammatory chemicals and form more of an immune response, which will eventually lead to platelet and protein deposits on the outside of the plaque, or outside of the fatty streak, which will turn it into plaque. And you can see here there's a micrograph of a plaqued artery that has significantly decreased flow. And this is the picture of the clean artery, and this is a picture of a somewhat clogged artery. You can see a significantly more roughness to the surface of the artery, as well as less space for blood to flow. And some leading risk factors for heart disease are high levels of cholesterol in the blood, particularly from LDL cholesterol, diets high in saturated fat, cholesterol, and trans fats, family history, obviously. If you don't get enough folate, you can also be at risk. In general, if you're not eating fruits, vegetables, and fiber, then you are at more of a risk for heart disease. If you have low HDL cholesterol or high triglycerides in the blood, or hypertension, which is high blood pressure, you can be at a significantly increased risk. Smoking is the absolute worst. Physical inactivity is also bad because if you are not physically active, then you're not stimulating your body to use the triglycerides in your blood, which is going to increase their quantity. As well as obesity. If you're obese, then you're in general going to have a significantly higher amount of triglycerides in your blood at all times. And diabetes can interfere with your body's ability to process sugar, which will lead to it inevitably being stored as fat, and this will increase the amount of fat in your blood. So this is a description of the buildup and breakup of plaque on the inside of your artery. So normally LDL slides easily in and out of layers of cells that line the blood vessel. If you get too much, then some of the particles will stick to the inside of the blood vessels. This will then undergo oxidation and sugar coating and other chemical changes, which signals the immune system that it has to take action and produces inflammation. Then the white blood cells will eat the LDL, which will form a fat pool in the lining of the blood vessel, also known as a fatty streak, which will eventually cause high blood pressure, faster heart rate, and if you smoke and have high LDL, this will continue to produce inflammation and create instability within the plaque itself. If the plaque bursts open, then chunks of fat will flow out into the bloodstream again and form clots, which can block your artery entirely and cause a heart attack or stroke. In general, we're finding more and more that despite men being at a higher risk for heart disease, it kills more women than men, possibly because women are at a lower risk, so they are not in general, it's not looked for in them as regularly. And specifically, African American women have a higher risk, most likely because of the higher prevalence of diabetes and high blood pressure and high stress environments within that demographic. Other things that can hurt you are lack of sleep, yo-yo dieting or fad dieting, where you have large dips and spikes in your weight, as well as depression. The Annals of Internal Medicine in April 2nd, 2002 did a study where they determined that 5 hours after a high-fat meal, blood flow fell by 18% in cardiac vessels, and triglycerides more than doubled in the blood. This could be a reason some people get chest pains after eating a fatty meal. It also indicates that every snack or meal counts, and that if you are on a good exercise routine and you do something incredibly physically strenuous and then immediately go and eat 3,000 calories worth of hamburgers and french fries, you are probably going to store almost all of that as body fat. So more about heart disease, there's a couple things that we've discovered recently: C-reactive protein and homocysteine, which are good indicators of your risk of heart disease. C-reactive protein is something produced by the liver when you have episodes of acute inflammation, and it is therefore a marker for inflammation caused by a number of things, including rheumatoid arthritis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, lupus, and heart attack. If you have a test for this, it can detect chronic inflammation of blood vessels, and this is believed to be indicative of heart disease. The women's health study done by Tufts University tested almost 40,000 healthy postmenopausal American women, and they determined that women with the highest level of CRP had a 5-fold increase of cardiovascular disease and 7-fold increase of having a MI or stroke compared to those with low levels, which could help identify heart disease in women and reduce their death rate from it. This also is helpful for people with no risk factors to determine whether they are at risk anyway. Another study of men showed that CRP is a potent predictor of heart attack risk for men as well as women. It's better in women than in men, especially better than reading the cholesterol, LDL, and homocysteine levels, or something called lipoprotein A. And then another study showed that statins, which are a type of drug, can reduce the levels of CRP and heart attack risk, even if you don't have high cholesterol. And then homocysteine. This is an irritant. It's a derivative of certain amino acids. It's implicated in impairing dilation or expansion of blood vessels, and it's considered to be a better predictor of heart disease than cholesterol levels, although C-reactive protein might be better. This was basically determined by something called the Framingham study. And besides elevated homocysteine, age and BMI being body mass index, which is a measure of body fat content, these all seem to correlate with heart disease. So the takeaway message is the more body fat you have, the more likely it is that you're at risk of heart disease. However, if you aren't overweight but still consume an incredibly high fat diet, you also might still be at risk. And if you have chronic inflammation from things like smoking or other sources, you will be at risk as well. So, another finding from 2013 found that carnitine and choline, which are found in primarily animal products, is converted to something called trimethylamine N oxide by bacteria in your GI tract. And this increases your risk of heart disease as well. So, just one more thing to worry about. And all this talk about heart disease brings up the concept of trans fats. So trans fats are a type of saturated fat that is unnaturally produced from unsaturated fats. They convert liquid oils into solid form by bombarding them with hydrogen, and this creates things like margarine. The thing about trans fats is that they are a major risk for cardiovascular disease, because not only are they saturated fats, but they are non-naturally occurring saturated fats. Your body really doesn't need them at all. And as such, they are now required to be listed on nutrition facts labels because they're trying to get rid of them from food because of how bad they are for you. So we mentioned before the double bonds in polyunsaturated fats leading to kinks in the carbon chain, which makes them not easily solidified. When you break that bond, you create just this long chain fatty acid, which of course gets made into a chylomicron and bounces around your body until you digest all the fat inside of it. So, if we can't use trans fats, what do we use instead? And just like artificial sweeteners, you can use something called a fat replacer. It feels like fat, it cooks like fat, it tastes like fat, but it doesn't have any calories. Things such as what we call interesterified fats, they aren't technically trans fats, but they are still harmful. The interesterification process rearranges fat molecules to make them solid at room temperature and lowers their melting point. These are new enough that there's no specific labeling to alert us, but manufacturers might call them interesterified oils or fully hydrogenated oils, but they're not actually required to tell you that they're using these things. But Surprise, surprise, researchers have found that both trans fats and interestified fats raised levels of LDL cholesterol and lowered HDL cholesterol, while also impacting blood glucose levels. Both of the diets high in modified fats were found to raise fasting glucose. In addition, interestified fats also suppress insulin production and raise your postprandial glucose, which is the glucose in your blood following a meal, by 40%. High blood sugar leads to spikes and crashes, as well as leading to the early stages of type 2 diabetes. Another artificial fat is olestra. It also doesn't have any calories, but it causes abdominal cramping and loose stools. It inhibits the absorption of vitamins and other nutrients like vitamin A, D, E, and K, which are fat soluble. In general, these are added to olestra to compensate for this. However, they removed the warning label requirement in 2003, so you may not know. 2011, Purdue University researchers determined that rats who were fed olestra containing potato chips as part of a high-fat diet ate more overall and gained more weight than those who were fed high-fat diet and regular full-fat potato chips, meaning that you are probably shooting yourself in the foot, much the same way that drinking a lot of soda with artificial sweeteners will probably make you desire and consume more sugar overall. Part of the reason for this is that the olestra changes the way your body responds to food, which interferes with your natural ability to regulate your hunger. And this is just a picture. It's a bit blurry, and I apologize, but this is a regular triglyceride molecule. We mentioned the glycerol backbone with the fatty acids. Olestra is a ring structure with the fatty acids sticking off the side. So you can imagine that this is significantly more difficult to digest. This is bonded to a sucrose molecule, and it's too big for our bodies to absorb. So the pros and cons of olestra. Pros are that it doesn't have any calories, it doesn't have any saturated fat, it doesn't have any cholesterol, it withstands frying, it withstands baking, and it tastes like fat. However, you lose vitamins, you lose phytochemicals, you have the potential for digestive upset and anal leakage. It has a slight aftertaste, and I've personally noticed this in cheaply made baked goods. Something that leaves that greasy feeling on the inside of your mouth without any taste. I think that's olestra. It's also expensive and not really well tested on things like on people like children. So it's probably even worse for children than for adults. Just saying. You're better off just learning to eat less fat and exercising more. So that it concludes our discussion of lipids, and there will be a quiz that will encompass basically lipids and carbohydrates that I will post, and that will be due in a week. Thanks for tuning in, and have a good night.